Okay, so let's take a look at the um, vocab term, the discriminant. That's kind of our main vocab term for today. So in the quadratic formula, x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The expression under the radical sign, which is b squared minus 4ac, the little part under the square root sign, is what we call the discriminant. You can use the discriminant to determine the number of real solutions of a quadratic equation. Okay, so what that is saying is there's a part of this equation that tells you a little bit something about that equation. So when we say real solutions of a quadratic equation, we're talking about solutions to the equation when we set it equal to 0. So we say, when does the function equal 0? Okay, you'll notice that in the drawing on the right, it equals 0 in 2 locations. So the output, the value along the y-axis, is 0 in 2 locations. Another way to phrase that is it has 2 x-intercepts. Okay, there's 2 solutions to that equation when you say, I want to know when this equation equals 0. If you look in the middle picture, there's only one solution. On the first picture, however, there are no solutions. Okay, so this is what we mean by the term discriminant, is that we are going to discriminate between these 3 options. If you've heard the word discriminate, you've probably heard it in kind of like a history class, social context. For example, a big example would be water fountains for different races. So if you have colored only watered fountains in the 1960s, that is a form of discrimination, right? That's usually how we hear it. We usually think of it as a very bad thing, and it is. When you discriminate on people based off qualities that they have, that's usually not a very good thing to do. However, discriminate in general just means to kind of choose different outcomes based off of some information. So the information that we're basing our outcomes off is what is under the square root sign, and the outcome is how many solutions there are. Now, the reason why this discriminant tells us that is this little plus or minus sign. Okay, so if the quadratic formula is giving us solutions to a quadratic equation, and the formula has a plus or minus sign in it, you should expect there to be 2 answers in most cases, because you'll have plus or minus that whole thing in the square root sign. So one answer will be plus that value, one answer will be minus that value, and you'll have 2 different solutions. Okay, so what would have to occur for there to only be one solution? Well, it would have to be something where what you're plussing and minusing actually ends up being the same thing. So the only case where that would be if you add 0 and subtract 0, right? If I add 5 and I subtract 5, those are 2 different things. But adding 0 and subtracting 0 are really the same thing. So if b squared minus 4ac ends up equaling 0, you won't have a plus or minus thing going on. You'll really only have negative b over 2a in the end. The rest of it will go away. And that will be the location of your x-intercept. It turns out negative b over 2a, if you don't know already, that tells you where the middle of a quadratic graph is in all cases. So it's interesting that we can find that within our quadratic formula, and it is the solution when that discriminant is equal to 0. Okay, what happens if our discriminant is not a positive number? So what happens if we're taking the square root of a negative number? Well, when you take the square root of a negative number, you can't really find any real solutions. You can't find any negative number that when you multiply it by itself becomes a negative number. You can't find any positive number that does that. So let me kind of write that out. What I'm saying is that if we wanted the square root of negative 100, well, if I take 10 squared, I get positive 100. If I take negative 10 squared, I also get positive 100, and I don't really have any option. There is no real number that I can square that will give me a negative value. There is no real number I can square that will give me a negative value. Okay, so if I'm trying to take the square root of a negative number, I'm not going to get an answer. Therefore, I'm not going to get any solution here. Okay, so those are the three situations. It is either that you have no solutions because your discriminant was less than 0. Your discriminant was a negative number. You get one real solution when your discriminant equaled 0. And you get two solutions anytime that discriminant is just some positive number overall. All right, so we'll move on and look at some examples of using those discriminants in the next video.